I live in Toronto. There are a lot of Hamas protests here, same in Montreal. The two cities are unrecognizable in that way. Both were very friendly to Jews and all minorities. That changed. What's crazy is they're not protesting Israel so much as protesting Jews. That's called anti-Semitism. It's been going on for months. I remember one of the first protests was outside a Jewish community center and a daycare, the Spadina Jewish Community Center in Toronto. Who protests outside a Jewish daycare to shout at children? They had a protest in Toronto outside a large Jewish hospital, the Mount Sinai Hospital. Obviously, it's a hospital that takes people of all backgrounds, but they chose a Jewish-founded hospital with lots of Jewish doctors. What's that got to do with Israel? That's got to do with hating Jews. There were protests at Jewish restaurants, or at least restaurants owned by Jews, or those that serve Jewish food, like Cafe Landwehr. I know a little bit about Cafe Landwehr. I've been there. It was started in Germany. It had to be shut down, of course, because of Hitler. Its descendants restarted it in Toronto, and same with the descendants of Hitler. They restarted in Toronto, too. Jewish-owned businesses that have nothing to do with Jewish anything are targeted. You might know that Chapters Indigo is owned by a Jewish woman, Heather Eastman, and her husband, who's also Jewish. It's not a Jewish business in any way, but a Jew owns it. So they vandalized and attacked that business. Now, those are all minor attacks, but of course, there were some major attacks that could have been deadly. In Montreal, a Molotov cocktail, a firebomb was thrown, gunshots at synagogues and schools. Of course, in Toronto, there's vandalism everywhere. There's graffiti that more or less says, "Kill the Jews." There's posters being held at protests with machine guns. There's posters on posts that say, "By any means necessary," showing a gun. Those are calls for death, for murder. They're not pretending to be political. They're not really going through the effort anymore. They just realize they can get away with pure Jew hatred. They don't really have to pretend. They blocked a road into a Jewish neighborhood. There's a road called Avenue Road. It's a bridge that goes over the 401 highway. It's one of only two ways into a large Jewish community with schools and residences. Hamas protesters would block it. It is miles away from anything political, anything economic. It was just blocking a Jewish neighborhood. And that went on for days and days and days. And police brought them coffee.
No one told them they can't come back, otherwise he would have said, "Okay, I understand."
Okay, I'll just ask just so. Sorry, it's the person with the vest.
Jihad? Yeah.
And now they've moved a little bit north to a Jewish community in Thornhill, in a city called Vaughan. They protested not at an Israeli embassy. There's no Israeli embassy in Vaughan, Ontario. They protested in Jewish neighborhoods, near Jewish houses and a Jewish synagogue. There's been no one condemning this in high office, not the Premier of Ontario or the Premier of Quebec, and certainly not the Prime Minister. He talks about these protests. He's actually talked about it a few times. And what he has to say is, that's their free speech. Really? Here's a clip of that.
Can you comment about some of the protests that we've been seeing across the country in relation to the Israel-Hamas war, but particularly in Toronto? I mean, you had experience with this last weekend where your event was canceled, and a lot of people were upset about that, upset how they've been, Toronto police has talked about the hostility and confrontation between police and protesters now. What specifically is your government, if anything, going to do about this, or are these protests just allowed to happen in our country because it's a free country?
Well, first of all, nobody can remain indifferent to the suffering and the anguish going on in Gaza right now, this loss of civilian lives and the impact on Canadian families and people who are worried about their loved ones is entirely understandable. Canadians have a right to protest, absolutely, to make their anguish, their anger heard by other Canadians. That's important, and we will always protect that right. But when the protests turn to hatred or to acts of harassment, particularly against fellow Canadians, there's a line that's crossed. I've heard from too many members of the Jewish community particularly who are seeing their synagogues, their community centers, their neighborhoods protested, who feel unsafe in their own country.
So chanting for intifada revolution, intifada being an Arabic word for a riot, a race riot, a pogrom as it would be called in Russia, signs with guns on them, and violence, more violence in a single day than in the entire trucker convoy. Compare Trudeau's reaction to the Hamas protest to his reaction to the truckers. Trudeau appointed an anti-Islamophobia commissioner named Amira El-Gawabi, but there's actually not a lot of Islamophobia to be against. There's no hateful protests outside mosques. There's no vandalism of mosques. There's no assault on Muslims. What this anti-Islamophobia commissioner is spending her time doing is defending these protests, saying that they are legitimate. She's not being an anti-Islamophobia commissioner. She's being a pro-anti-Semitism commissioner. Trudeau also appointed a anti-Semitism commissioner. Bizarrely, he chose a non-Jew for the position, Deborah Lyons. I guess there was no Jew available or no Jew who cared enough, or maybe the Jews all cared too much. I'm not quite sure. I really don't know what Deborah Lyons does. I know she took a first-class trip to Israel for some photo ops, but other than that, all I can detect is every once in a while she writes some pathetic tweets on Twitter to her small following that basically say, "Come on, guys, let's stop hating the Jews." It really is pitiful.